Desmond Forde only meant to return the phone he found, wedged beneath the inspection scaffolding on the lower deck of the Kellaway Bridge. But when the screen pulsed to life against his palm in the gray November light, the widower and father of one went completely still. Staring back at him from the lock screen was a photograph of himself at 22 years old. He was standing in the atrium of Queen's University's engineering building, beside a scale model of a suspension bridge with a 3-meter span and hand-tensioned cable wires that he and another student had spent 4 months building in a borrowed lab on Saturday mornings. He was wearing the red fleece he'd owned for 6 years straight. His expression held the particular relief of someone who had just heard his team's name announced over the faculty public address system as the winners of the National Undergraduate Design Competition. He remembered exactly how the afternoon light had come through the atrium windows. He remembered the smell of the wood glue they hadn't quite cleaned off the work table in time for the judges. He also knew, without question, that the original photograph had included 2 people. The phone belonged to Celestine Marchand. The name was printed on the site access badge clipped to the lanyard that had fallen beside it. Marchand Infrastructure Group, Chief Executive Officer. The firm had been shortlisted for the provincial bridge rehabilitation contract that Desmond's office was currently reviewing, which meant she had been among the group of representatives who had walked the Kellaway's lower inspection deck that morning, which meant that the most powerful executive in the country's private infrastructure sector had been carrying, as the image she chose to look at every time she unlocked her phone, a cropped photograph of a 22-year-old version of Desmond Forde, taken on the best afternoon of his 3rd year of university, in a moment that had also belonged to someone else who had since disappeared from his life, without a word of explanation. 23 years had passed. He stood on the Kellaway's lower deck in the November, cold with the phone in his hand, and tried to account for the distance between that atrium and this moment, and found that he could not do it in any way that made sense. He heard voices from the upper platform, footsteps on the steel grating, and the vibration of someone moving quickly enough that the bridge structure carried it through his boots before he saw her. Celestine Marchand came around the curve of the lower walkway and stopped when she saw him holding the phone. There was a long beat of recognition. Hers arrived first, and it moved through her face in rapid succession. The initial flash of recall, something much sharper underneath it, and then a composed stillness that spoke of a person who had spent 2 decades managing her expressions in rooms full of people watching for weakness. She was dressed for a site inspection in a dark coat and steel-toed boots that looked brand new, and she carried herself with the precision of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person present. Desmond handed the phone back without a word. She looked at his face and understood immediately that he had seen the lock screen. The 2 members of her site team, who had come around the corner behind her, withdrew at a small gesture from Celestine, and the 2 of them stood alone on the lower deck of the Kellaway Bridge while 23 years tried to arrange themselves into something that could be spoken aloud. She asked the only question that cut to the center of it. Had he never received any of her messages? He told her the truth. He had waited. He had called the number she'd given him 8 times over that first summer. He had written to her Montreal address until the autumn of the following year, when a brief letter arrived in his campus mailbox, signed with her name, telling him that what they had been was a student thing, the kind that didn't survive the real world, and that she had decided it was better not to continue. He had read it on the steps of the engineering building on a Tuesday morning, and had gone directly to his afternoon's seminar and not told anyone. Celestine absorbed this without moving. Then she said that she had left him 14 voicemails, that she had written to him 12 times, that she had called his parents' house in Sudbury collect, because she hadn't been able to reach him any other way, and that each time the line had rung through. without anyone picking up. To understand why that accounting felt like something structural giving way underfoot. 12 letters, 14 messages. The collect calls to a house he had been living in all that summer. It was necessary to go back to the year that had made them both, and then quietly taken itself apart. Celestine had arrived at Queen's in their third year as a transfer from the École Polytechnique de Montréal, coming mid-semester with the measured composure of someone who had grown up understanding that her family name opened certain doors and also made certain rooms go quiet. Henri Marchand had built Marchand Infrastructure, from a two-person firm in Laval into the largest private bridge and civil engineering group in the country. And most people Celestine met in the engineering faculty treated her accordingly, with a mixture of deference and distance that she had learned not to expect anything different from. Desmond had not done that. He sat beside her in the structural analysis seminar, not because he was unaware of who her father was, but because she had written something on the whiteboard in response to the professor's load distribution problem that he wanted to understand better, and she had noticed that what he wanted was the answer rather than the association. They began working together on the undergraduate design competition entry, 2 months before the submission deadline, and what started as a practical collaboration across an empty seminar table on Tuesday evenings became something neither of them had anticipated. Celestine managed the load calculations and the theoretical modeling with a precision that made Desmond reconsider his own assumptions every time she handed back a marked-up draft. He handled the physical construction and the material behavior testing, translating her mathematics into something that could be held and measured and adjusted. They won in April. The photograph was taken that afternoon, the two of them standing beside the model with the uncomplicated happiness of people who have not yet learned what happiness eventually costs. By May, they had been talking seriously about what came next. Desmond had an offer from a provincial engineering consultancy in Ottawa. Celestine had been accepted to a graduate program in structural dynamics at McGill. The geography was manageable. The intention between them had been clear enough that it didn't require a formal conversation to be understood. The week before convocation, Celestine told him that her father had asked her to spend the summer in Montreal. There was a major contract in negotiation, a federal procurement for bridge rehabilitation on the Trans-Canada corridor, and Henri wanted her involved early so she understood the business side before she started her graduate program. She would be back in September. She would call him the moment she had a fixed number at her family's house. She had called 14 times. He had never picked up. He enrolled in the Provincial Infrastructure Certification Program that fall. He built a quiet career with the Ministry of Transportation's Structural Review Division, spending 12 years learning to read bridges the way other people learned to read faces, looking for the signs of stress that don't announce themselves until something has already begun to fail. He had married Lynn, a landscape architect with a dry wit and an absolute refusal to be impressed by anything she hadn't verified herself, and they had raised their daughter Nora together in the house in Hamilton that they had renovated one room at a time over 7 years. Lynn had died 3 years ago, 14 months after a diagnosis that had rearranged everything Desmond thought he knew about what mattered. The grief of that was real and permanent, and not something he had any interest in comparing to anything else. Celestine's letter was still in a shoebox in the bedroom closet. He had not thought about it in a long time, but on the other side of that phone call, a young woman had been listening to a line ring out 14 times, and eventually concluding, as people in pain tend to conclude, that silence means what it appears to mean. Celestine suggested they speak properly, away from the inspection site, and Desmond agreed on the condition that he needed 40 minutes to complete the day's structural assessment log before he could leave. When they sat across from each other in the small conference room at the ministry's Hamilton district office, The first thing he did was give her the context she deserved to have. He had been married, he said, to a woman he had loved, and who was gone now, and he was raising their daughter on his own, and he needed her to understand that he was not approaching this conversation as though the last 23 years were something that could be stepped around. Celestine heard it not as a warning, but as an accurate description of who he had become. She said she understood, and she did not try to reframe the afternoon into something it wasn't. She explained the lock screen photograph without apology. It was a scan of the only physical image she still had from their time at Queens, recovered from her mother's attic when the older woman had downsized to a condo in Westmount. The crop was a product of the phone's clock display, cutting across the left half of the frame. The full photograph included her, standing beside him, but the home screen widget covered that half entirely. She had never changed the image. She offered this without defensiveness, and that told Desmond something that no explanation could have conveyed on its own. She had not married. There had been a 3-year relationship with a man her family had approved of, an architect from a well-connected Quebec family with the right credentials and the right manner, and she had ended it when it became clear that what he was actually interested in was the Marchand balance sheet, and not the person who happened to be running it. She had taken over as chief executive from Henri 8 years ago, rebuilt the firm's technical division after a difficult contract dispute had weakened its reputation, and had done it while being the only member of the Marchand family who had ever actually studied structural engineering, rather than simply inherited the letterhead. Desmond asked why she had never found him. She answered with the kind of honesty that requires something to give. She had found him, she said, years ago. She had seen that he was married with a child, and she had made the deliberate decision not to introduce any disturbance into a life that appeared to be whole. She had considered it the respectful choice. He sat with that quietly and did not argue the logic of it, even though something in the precision of the calculation made the distance between them feel very deliberately maintained. They did not have time to go further, because Roland Keach walked into the conference room with the assured energy of a man who presumed access to every space he entered, and had rarely been corrected on that presumption. Keach was the chief acquisition officer for Dunbar Structural Partners, the largest of the firms also shortlisted for the Kellaway rehabilitation contract, and he had been at the site that morning as part of the same review group. He took in the scene with a single sweep. Celestine at the table, Desmond across from her, the ministry logo on the wall behind them, and smiled with the part of his expression that had nothing to do with warmth. He said he hadn't realized Ms. Marchand and the reviewing inspector were acquainted outside of the formal process. Celestine introduced Desmond as someone she knew from university. Keach said the name carefully, as though he were memorizing it for a different purpose, made a brief excuse about needing to return a call, and left. In the corridor, his phone was already at his ear. The Kellaway Bridge Rehabilitation Project had stalled 3 months earlier when a routine load test on one of the rehabilitated truss sections had produced anomalous deflection readings. Values that fell within the acceptable tolerance range, but that appeared in a pattern inconsistent with the structural model Marchand's engineering team had submitted. The Provincial Review Office had flagged the anomaly. The contract had been placed on a compliance hold, and Desmond had been assigned as the independent structural reviewer. The Marchand engineering team had attributed the deflection pattern to localized variability in the original concrete substrate, a plausible explanation for a bridge of the Kellaway's age. It was, as it turned out, plausible and wrong. Keach had been pressing through intermediaries for the compliance hold to be resolved before the contract award decision, because Dunbar Structural stood to be named preferred bidder if Marchand was disqualified on technical grounds, and the award panel's timeline was fixed. The Marchand team had completed a supplementary analysis supporting their substrate explanation, and the compliance officer assigned to the file had signed off on returning the project to active review. The hold had been lifted 2 days before Desmond arrived on the Kellaway for what was formally described as a final pre-award structural confirmation. Desmond had been running a standard deflection survey on the rehabilitated truss when he noticed something in the load response data that the supplementary analysis had not accounted for. The anomalous readings appeared only during the brief window when a heavy vehicle crossed the adjacent lane while the survey equipment was recording from below the deck. Taken individually, the readings looked like substrate variability. Taken together, across 4 separate survey positions, they described a consistent lateral resonance pattern that did not belong in a rehabilitated truss of this design. He brought this to Aubrey Winslow, the ministry's chief structural engineer, a man in his early 60s who had overseen bridge reviews across Ontario for 30 years, and who listened to Desmond's analysis with the attentiveness of someone who had learned the hard way to take unusual readings seriously before dismissing them. Winslow pulled the Marchand submission files and asked Desmond to walk him through the pattern in detail. What Desmond described, methodically and without drama, was a secondary resonance frequency in the rehabilitated truss section that matched the known failure signature of a specific grade of epoxy anchor bolt that had been approved for structural use in the early part of the decade and subsequently found to develop microfractures under cyclic lateral load. The bolts were not defective when installed. They degraded on a timeline that made them appear sound during routine inspections, and then, under sustained traffic loading, begin to transmit load in ways the original structural design had not accommodated. The bolt grade in question had been specified in the Marchand Rehabilitation Plan. Desmond had found the specification in Appendix 4 of the submission, buried in a materials table that ran to 11 pages. Winslow ordered a physical inspection of the anchor bolt assemblies on the rehabilitated truss section. The results confirmed what the resonance data had described. 14 of the 62 bolts in the primary anchor array showed early-stage microfracturing consistent with the known degradation pattern. Not a failure, not imminent collapse. The kind of finding that appears in the engineering reports that precede failures, written in hindsight, after someone has had to explain why the warning signs were present and not acted upon. Celestine was notified through the formal compliance channel, and she suspended the contract process and ordered a full structural audit of every rehabilitated section the firm had completed under the affected specification. She accepted the financial consequences without qualification. Winslow, who had watched Desmond identify a progressive failure mode that the Marchand team's own engineers and the compliance review had both missed, asked whether Desmond would consider taking a formal consulting appointment to assist with the broader audit. The arrangement would be documented, reported through Winslow's office independently of any executive involvement, and structured to keep a clear arm's length. Between the technical work and the personal history that Kitch had already clocked and filed away for future use, Desmond agreed to those terms and added one of his own. Every finding he produced would go to Winslow in writing before any communication with Celestine's office, so that no one could later argue the work had been shaped by anything other than the data and the physical evidence. What neither man had noticed yet was that the anchor bolt specification introducing the defective grade into the Marchand Rehabilitation Plan had been inserted through a materials substitution amendment filed 14 months earlier, submitted under a subcontractor designation that traced back to a procurement introduction Kitch had personally brokered through a former colleague at a materials supply firm that Dunbar Structural had quietly acquired the year before. The Kellaway Rehabilitation Project remained on hold for inspection, and over the following 2 weeks, Desmond and Celestine found themselves in proximity more often than the formal arrangement required. Not by design. An audit of this scope on a live bridge in an active traffic corridor creates a compressed working geography in which the relevant people encounter one another at the site trailer, at the document review table, in the parking area at 6:30 in the morning when the day's survey window opens. They were careful about it, and honest about being careful, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Celestine brought him photographs of text messages she had saved, screenshots from a recovered backup on an old device, messages she had sent to a number that had been his student phone, still on the plan his parents had been paying for that summer. The messages described a young woman navigating a Montreal summer where she knew no one outside of her family, calculating the weeks until September, describing the commute between her parents' house in Outremont and the Marchand offices in the Old Port as beautiful and completely beside the point. He had never received a single one. He showed her the letter he had kept. She read it standing at the window of the site trailer, holding the single page with both hands as though it required steadying. When she finished, she said only that she had not written those sentences. They compared the signature, her name written in the slanted cursive she had learned at the Francophone school she'd attended in Laval, with the particular crossbar on the capital C that she had carried forward unchanged since she was 9 years old. Against the signature on the letter in his shoebox, the crossbar was there, but it sat at the wrong angle. The shape was approximate. It had been studied but not inhabited. Neither of them said the name aloud. Desmond said he wanted documented evidence before any accusation was made, because transforming private pain into a public claim without proof was a way of becoming exactly the kind of person he had spent his adult life refusing to be. Priya Sethi, Marchand's legal compliance director, initiated an audit of the historical correspondence and communications records held in the family's retained legal archive. What she found was that all personal mail addressed to Henri Marchand's household during the summer following Celestine's graduation had been processed through the offices of Keach and Associates Legal, a small family practice operated by Roland Keach's father, under a household management retainer. Roland, 21 years old that summer and working for his father between undergraduate years, had been listed as junior correspondence coordinator. Nora Forde arrived at the site trailer one afternoon to drop off a document Desmond had left at home. A standard school permission form that needed his signature before 3 o'clock. She encountered Celestine briefly in the doorway, and Celestine did not attempt to perform warmth for a 17-year-old girl, whose instincts were almost certainly already well calibrated to tell the difference between people who were making an effort and people who were simply present. She said she was an old acquaintance of Desmond's from university, asked what Nora was taking in her final year, and listened with genuine attention when Nora said she was focused on environmental science and data analysis. Celestine said those two fields shared the same fundamental discipline, learning to ask the question precisely enough that the data actually tells you something. Nora went home and mentioned to her father, in the carefully neutral tone of a teenager who had formed an opinion and was deciding how much to share, that his colleague seemed like someone who gave real answers. That same evening, Desmond found the original competition photograph in the box of university papers he kept at the back of the hall closet. A physical print, faded at the corners, both figures intact. Him and Celestine, unedited, neither of them removed from the other's story. He turned it over. In handwriting he barely recognized as his own younger self's, he had written on the back, "Someday I'll understand why this one mattered so much." He hadn't known, at 22, that he was writing it down, because some part of him already understood that it was the kind of thing that could get lost. Then came the story, arriving first as a Ministry of Transportation internal leak, then as a post on a provincial infrastructure newsfeed. Someone had passed along an account describing the Kellaway audit as a situation in which an independent structural reviewer with a prior personal connection to the firm under review had inserted himself into the compliance process and was now producing findings that conveniently painted Marchand's primary competitor in the worst possible light by association. The framing suggested that Desmond's identification of the anchor bolt issue was more consistent with someone trying to manufacture technical credibility than with someone genuinely finding a pre-existing defect. The story did not name Keach as a source. It did not need to. Keach presented the coverage to the contract award panel as a matter of procedural concern, with the measured gravity of a man who had not written the story himself, but was deeply troubled by what it raised. He moved for Desmond's removal from the audit and a full review of the conflict of interest provisions governing the Kellaway file. He noted, with the particular precision of someone who had been rehearsing the sentence, that a structural inspector who had been present on the lower deck of the bridge on the morning a senior executive lost her phone and spent several minutes alone with an unlocked device, had been in a position to access proprietary engineering documents, calculation files, and internal correspondence. He suggested that a reviewer with access to that kind of information might have had reasons for his diagnostic conclusions that did not originate in the field data. Desmond was placed on a formal administrative hold, removed from the active audit, and asked to surrender his ministry site credentials pending a review. He complied without argument and requested that every step of the review process be recorded. He also requested, in writing through Priya Sethi, that the phone's technical log be independently examined. The phone had never been unlocked. Its biometric authentication had not been bypassed. The only thing accessible from the screen in the state Desmond had found it was whatever was displayed on the lock screen when it activated. Which was the photograph? Keach did not withdraw the insinuation. He redirected it, allowing the narrative to do the work that the evidence refused to do. The single father of modest means, the powerful CEO, the 23-year gap, the image that raised questions no one in the firm had ever thought to ask about. Desmond, reading the coverage from his administrative suspension at the kitchen table, asked through Priya whether he could speak directly to Celestine. She came to the district office on a Wednesday afternoon, and he told her he was prepared to step away entirely, if she believed that was the right outcome for the firm and for herself. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he did not have an immediate response to. If he was stepping away because he had genuinely concluded the situation was unsalvageable, she would respect that without argument. But if he was stepping away because Roland Kitch had written a story about who he was, and he had decided the story was easier to walk away from than to stand against, then the man who left this room was making the same choice he had made 23 years ago, when he had read a letter he believed she had sent, and decided that silence was the only reasonable answer. And she would like him to think about whether that was who he intended to keep being. He thought about it across a long afternoon. He stayed. 3 days into his suspension, Winslow discovered a set of documents that had been submitted to the Kellaway audit file through an internal routing system. A technical memorandum bearing Desmond's digital credentials, which appeared to predate the discovery of the anchor bolt issue and described a remediation pathway that would have cleared the Marchand rehabilitation plan without requiring a physical inspection. The memo had not been written by Desmond. The credential tag had been replicated from a document he had legitimately submitted 6 weeks earlier, when the ministry's shared filing system had required all active reviewers to re-authenticate. The system access log showed that the fraudulent memo had been uploaded from a device, registered to an account, used by a consultant employed by Dunbar Structural Partners. Winslow and Desmond worked quietly over 5 days, mapping the document trail against the amendment history of the Kellaway contract file. The pattern was exact. Every material substitution that had introduced the defective bolt grade had been processed during a 48-hour window following an internal progress report routed through the contract compliance desk that Ketch's firm had been granted observer access to under the standard competitive review protocol. The substitutions had not been accidental. They had been executed by someone who understood the specification review process well enough to know which amendments would clear the automated compliance checks without triggering a manual review, and who had access to the internal routing system. Keach had been positioning the award panel for months. His formal submission, prepared by an advisory firm with undisclosed connections to Dunbar, Structural's parent holding company, argued that the Marchand disqualification on technical grounds, combined with the conflict of interest concerns now attached to the independent review, created grounds for accelerating the contract award to the next-ranked bidder. That bidder was Dunbar Structural. The valuation applied to the remaining contract work reflected the compliance complications and the reputation damage to Marchand rather than the actual scope and the actual competitive price. What was not in the submission was a side arrangement, documented in a memorandum of understanding that had not yet surfaced, under which Keach would receive a senior appointment at Dunbar's infrastructure division and a share of the contract's fee revenue from the moment the award was finalized. The path to that outcome ran through a manufactured technical crisis and a manufactured conflict of interest, and Keach had been building both with considerable patience and reasonable confidence that no one would pull the two threads together. Priya Sethi found Margaret Dutil through a pension record from the dissolved Keach and Associates legal partnership. Margaret was 70 years old, retired, living in a lakeside community 2 hours north of Montreal. Her first response to Priya's call was to say that she had signed a confidentiality agreement at the time of the firm's dissolution and that she had nothing to add to any matter related to the Keach family. Priya told her, without embellishment, what Roland Keach was currently attempting to do with a bridge that had structurally defective anchor bolts in its primary truss array and a falsified document in its compliance file. Margaret agreed to speak. Her account was the account of someone who had spent 2 decades arranging a specific memory into a shape she could live comfortably with, and who had now decided that the weight of it was no longer worth carrying. Henri Marchand had asked the firm to hold his daughter's personal correspondence for 6 weeks that summer. He had not wanted to intercept it permanently. He had wanted to give Celestine time to settle into the Montreal rhythm, time to see whether the relationship with the young man in Ontario was something substantial, or something that belonged to the particular intensity of an academic collaboration. 6 weeks, and then everything would be forwarded, and she could decide for herself. That was the instruction as Margaret had understood it, and as the correspondence ledger reflected. Roland, 21 years old, demonstrating the particular initiative that would define his adult career, had done something different entirely on his own. He had held every letter from Desmond. He had held every message relay that came through the firm. He had composed 2 brief letters of conclusion, one in each voice, approximating each signature with the care of someone who had studied both closely enough to reproduce the shape, but not the motion, and he had arranged for them to reach their destinations through a forwarding pathway that bypassed the official hold. He had told Celestine when he visited Montreal the following winter, under the pretext of accompanying his father to a business meeting, that Desmond had been seeing someone at his program since September and had not seemed to want to make contact. Margaret had seen the correspondence ledger. 12 letters from Desmond Forde to Celestine Marchand, received and held between June and August. 14 voicemail relay logs from the same window, all sequestered, none destroyed, because Roland Keach, even at 21, had understood that physical records were leverage. The same storage boxes, transferred to a commercial archive facility when the firm dissolved, had never been formally requested for disposal, because no one with standing to make that request had known they existed. Inside the boxes, among the sealed envelopes, was a document that Priya described as the most structurally complete evidence of premeditated fraud she had seen in 15 years of compliance work. A memorandum of understanding between Roland Kitch and a numbered company registered in Alberta, whose beneficial ownership traced through 2 holding layers to a family trust, associated with the chairman of Dunbar Structural Partners. The memorandum described the acquisition strategy, the manufactured qualification failure, the timeline, and the performance conditions that together constituted a conspiracy to manipulate a public infrastructure procurement process. The same document that proved Kitch had separated 2 people 23 years earlier also proved that the pattern of behavior had never actually stopped. Desmond and Celestine were shown the letters together that evening, sitting across from each other at the long table in the ministry's district boardroom. The archive box was between them, and neither of them reached for the envelopes. They understood without discussing it that the letters belonged to 2 young people who had trusted each other with an uncomplicated certainty that is only available before life has taught you what certainty actually requires, and that those 2 people deserved to remain intact inside the sealed paper, unrevised by everything that had come after. Kitch moved first, because he had always understood that the person who controls the sequence controls the room. The morning before the contract award panel was scheduled to hear Priya's compliance findings, a document appeared in the ministry's internal system, a second falsified memo. This one appearing to show Desmond acknowledging in writing that he had been aware of the conflict of interest before accepting the reviewing appointment, and had chosen not to disclose it. The document had been uploaded through the same replicated credential pathway as the first. This time, Winslow had anticipated it. The system access log had been under continuous monitoring for 72 hours. The technical team had traced the upload pathway in real time, and the device it originated from was sitting in a Dunbar structural office in downtown Toronto when the upload occurred. The consultant whose account was being used was in a documented client meeting on the other side of the city at the same time. Desmond reviewed the sequence at his kitchen table that evening and told Nora that there would be some news coverage with his name in it, and that none of it reflected anything that required explanation. Nora said she knew, and asked if he needed her to stay home from school the next day. He said no. He said she should go. The award panel convened in the ministry's main boardroom, and Kitch structured his presentation with the confidence of a man who had mistaken preparation for certainty. He laid out the accumulation, the personal history, the lock screen photograph, the compliance concerns, the memos bearing Desmond's credentials, and he returned to the photograph deliberately, knowing its weight. The image of a 22-year-old man that a major infrastructure CEO had been carrying on her phone without disclosing it to any governance structure. He suggested the panel was entitled to draw its own conclusions. Celestine responded directly. A personal image on a private device was not a governance matter, and it did not constitute evidence of professional incapacity, and she was not going to pretend it didn't exist. And she was not going to explain it to a room full of people who had never once asked Roland Kitch to explain a single decision he had made in connection with this file. Priya presented the technical audit. The phone had not been unlocked. The access log documented the credential replication pathway. The falsified memo timestamps aligned with device records, placing the upload outside Desmond's physical location. Winslow followed with the engineering analysis, presenting in the unhurried manner of someone whose authority comes from precision rather than volume. He walked through the anchor bolt resonance data, the materials substitution timeline, and the correlation between each amendment and the routing of internal progress reports through Kitch's Observer Access account. He noted that every structural concern Desmond had raised had been confirmed by subsequent physical inspection, and that the one instance in which those concerns had been set aside The compliance clearance that had briefly lifted the hold had been the closest the Kellaway Bridge had come to having a documented progressive failure mode treated as substrate variability and left in service under increasing traffic load. Margaret Dutil testified by video link, her statement introduced formally by Priya as part of the compliance record. She described what she had seen in the Keech and Associates office in the summer 23 years earlier. The correspondence ledger, the sequential entries, the items that had arrived and been held, the 2 letters that had gone out bearing signatures she had not seen produced. She described it with the precision of someone who had reviewed the memory privately for a long time and had finally decided that accuracy was more important than comfort. Henri Marchand, seated at the far end of the table, confirmed that his instruction had extended only to a temporary hold on personal correspondence and that no fabrication had been authorized at any point. He said this without hedging, because he had spent the 2 preceding weeks understanding, with considerable clarity, what his decision to treat his daughter's happiness as a logistical problem to be managed had actually produced, and he had concluded that the only useful thing remaining to him was to be accurate about it. Desmond presented last. He walked through the component failure sequence, the amendment chain, the procurement trail, and the memorandum of understanding recovered from the archive. He did not narrate the personal dimension of the investigation. He presented it as a technical and legal record because that was what it was, and because the personal dimension had already been understood by everyone in the room before he arrived. When Keech said the signature on the memorandum of understanding was not his, Celestine placed the original document on the table, the notarial seal intact, the date stamp legible, and noted that the forensic unit had matched the fingerprint set on the document's lower corner that morning. The panel's decision was not close. Keech was suspended from all active procurement processes pending investigation by the provincial regulatory body and within 10 days by the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Office, which had been notified of the materials substitution scheme and opened its own file. Dunbar Structural's award application was withdrawn, and the firm's participation in the procurement was referred to the Public Prosecutor's Office. The shareholders of Dunbar's parent company were not pleased with what they read in the subsequent regulatory disclosures. Celestine retained the Kellaway contract with a condition she had proposed herself: a voluntary independent audit of every anchor bolt specification in the firm's active project portfolio. Not because she was required to offer it, but because she understood that the workers and engineers who trusted Marchand Infrastructure's specifications deserved to know that the verification systems protecting them had not been compromised by the same pattern of substitution. Henri resigned from the firm's advisory board in a letter addressed to his daughter rather than to the directorate. He acknowledged that his certainty in his own judgment had been the condition under which someone else's calculation had operated, and that he could not transfer that responsibility to anyone else. Celestine read the letter once, filed it, and did not respond for 2 weeks. At which point, she called him. The conversation did not resolve by the end of the first hour, but it was the first conversation of its kind they had ever had, and it was possible now in a way it had not been before. Desmond was formally cleared. The ministry offered him a senior appointment as Regional Structural Standards Coordinator, a position that would have placed him inside the provincial administrative structure at a level 2 grades above his current role. He declined. He explained, through Winslow, that accepting a position of that kind, while the Marchand relationship was active, would compromise the independence that made his work worth anything, and that he had spent enough of his professional life in situations where the technical and the personal had been deliberately confused by people who had an interest in the confusion. What he proposed instead was a partnership arrangement with Winslow, who had been considering independent practice for several years. They would establish a structural review consultancy, incorporated separately from any government body, contracted at standard market rates to multiple clients across the sector. The ministry would be one client among several. The proposal was accepted. The consultancy took its first 2 contracts in the same quarter. Desmond told Nora about the arrangement on a Sunday morning over coffee. She listened and then asked, with the directness of a teenager who had already reached her conclusion, whether Celestine was going to be involved in the business. He said the business arrangement and the other arrangement were 2 separate things. Nora said she understood that and asked again whether Celestine was going to be around. Desmond said they were working some things out. Nora said that seemed like a reasonable way to approach most things and went back to her environmental science reading. The months that followed moved at the pace of 2 people who had learned not to hurry conclusions. They saw each other when the work brought them to the same location, which was often enough. They had a series of dinners that neither of them announced as anything in particular, but that both of them showed up to having thought about what they wanted to say. They were navigating the distance between the people they had been at 22 and the people they were now, and they found that the navigating itself was something both of them were genuinely interested in, which was its own kind of answer without needing to be named one. The Kellaway Bridge rehabilitation was completed and certified 14 months after the afternoon. Desmond had found the phone on the inspection deck with a fully re-audited materials inventory and a verification protocol that Winslow had described in testimony to the regulatory body as the most rigorous anchor specification review process the provincial sector had implemented. The bridge opened to full traffic without anomaly. Desmond was not on the deck for the opening. His role was in the analysis that preceded and followed the work, not in the ceremony itself. But he watched the first morning's traffic data from the monitoring station in Hamilton with the specific attention of someone for whom this outcome had not been abstract. Nora graduated from her high school in Hamilton on a warm June evening under the same sky that had been over Queen's University the afternoon. Her father had built something he was proud of and stood beside someone he had not yet understood he was about to lose. Celestine attended the ceremony. She sat beside Desmond in the general seating, not in any reserved section, not as a donor to the school foundation, but as someone who was there because she wanted to be, for reasons that were entirely her own. Nora walked across the stage and found her father's face in the rows behind the reserved seats, and smiled the specific smile of someone who is satisfied with how a particular chapter has turned out. Afterward, the 3 of them went to the University Engineering Building, where the winning scale model bridge had been on display since a faculty donation placed it in a climate-controlled case in the main atrium, partially restored and mounted on a platform with a small placard listing the 2002 national competition and the names of the 2 students who had built it. Someone, Desmond had arranged it quietly through the faculty archives, had printed and framed the original full photograph and placed it on the wall beside the display case. Both figures present, unedited, standing together with the full future apparently ahead of them. Celestine handed Desmond her phone. The lock screen had been changed. The photograph of the 22-year-old in the red fleece was gone. In its place was an image taken at the Kellaway site on the morning of the bridge's certification. Desmond on the left, Celestine on the right, Nora between them, all 3 of them looking at something outside the frame, and all 3 of them laughing at whatever it was. He looked at it for a moment and asked whether replacing the old photograph meant she had decided to let go of what that image had held for her. She said no. She had kept the original in a separate folder because it belonged to a version of herself she still wanted to be able to find. She had changed the lock screen because she no longer needed an old photograph as a placeholder for someone she had found in the present. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper he had been carrying for a week. It was a letter he had written in the November of the year Celestine had left. Written but not sent, because he had already received what he believed was her answer and had decided there was no point. He had found it in the shoebox 3 days after Priya had returned the correspondence archive to him. He had read it once and folded it again, because it had been written by a 22-year-old who still believed that saying the right thing at the right time was a sufficient substitute for being present when it mattered. But there was one sentence, visible through the worn fold of the paper when held up to the light from the atrium windows, that he had written without knowing. He would spend the next 2 decades not quite forgetting it. If you ever find your way back to the beginning, I hope you'll find me still there. Celestine read it standing beside the display case, holding it with both hands. When she finished, she asked him what he had meant by the beginning. He did not produce a ring. He did not try to compress 23 years into a declaration. He asked her if she wanted to come home for dinner, to the house in Hamilton, to the kitchen table, where Nora did her homework on Tuesday evenings and the back window faced the garden that Lynn had planted and that Desmond had been keeping up in the approximate way of a person who knows a thing is worth preserving even when he doesn't fully know how. He said this not with the urgency of someone trying to recover lost time, but with the steadiness of someone who had decided that what came next was worth beginning carefully. Celestine said yes. The 3 of them walked out of the atrium together into the June evening, and behind them, in the climate-controlled case under the steady display lighting, the old-scale model bridge held its span on the same hand-tensioned wires it had held for 23 years. Evidence of the simpler, more durable truth that the things built carefully enough do not collapse when they are interrupted. They wait precisely where they were left, for the people who made them to find their way back.